Okay, we're on to number 7 right here. This is called divide the pie or follow the money. This is one that I think is sort of particularly good for the business kind of minded person right here. And what I find is actually this is one of those ones that I've personally seen works really, really well when you're sort of interested in an industry, but are trying to figure out how essentially to attack it, want to understand it. There's a lot of benefit in sort of just diving in and understanding it. So we'll talk a little bit about this one. It's a fun one, and in particular, I think you'll enjoy it a little bit. Divide the pie is one of those things where we are trying to take something that feels massive and complicated and figure out how to break it down into smaller pieces right there. And that's where this one comes from, right? Again, we think of the pie as sort of this broader set of information, this broader industry, this broader problem, to break it down into pieces where we divide the pie out. And so I think it's something that's probably most applicable to someone who's thinking from a sort of a money standpoint, a problem standpoint, sort of a number standpoint to do it right there. So it is about breaking something down into smaller pieces, identifying where you might find sort of interesting data relationships, sort of interesting places where you're seeing a combination of two things that sort of seem out of whack a little bit, and sort of looking for these macro opportunities. Now, again, it's important to note that this is one of those ones that does require you to sort of get under the hood a little bit to get inside the data, and sometimes you may have to do some research. You may need to get access to some reports. You may need to get kind of under the hood, I guess is the best way to describe it. But what you're looking for is trying to find, is there something in here that can teach you something that you may not have known? Now, I oftentimes find that MBA students of mine really, really attracted to this one. The math lover, my wife, who's an accountant, really digs this approach right here. So that's sort of the person who's really good at it. Also, someone who sort of wants to really, really understand the ins and outs of a particular industry can find this to be really good. So you do need to sort of dig in, understand stuff, get under the hood. There's a lot of Excel that you may need to do, some data analysis you may need to do, but there's some good stuff that I think you can come out of it if you approach it in this way. And so if you have that mindset where you're sort of looking for sort of this unique business opportunity, that could be it right there. And sort of the best story that I've found actually comes from some MBA founders who happen to be at Wharton for business school, University of Pennsylvania. And the problem sort of emerged for them is one of the founders who was sort of looking, they were in a computer lab together and was looking to try and buy replacement glasses, right? Needed a new pair of glasses, and was like going site to site to site, shopping to see if he could find cheaper glasses, calling around, and realized like all these prices are about the same. And he sort of enlisted the rest of his sort of MBA buddies and said, hey, let's dig in and sort of figure what's going on. And as they started to unpack this industry and started to see who are the players, how they fit together, who they were, their ownership were, they started to realize that almost the entire industry was owned by the same players. And that was what I think was the big insight for them, is that it's sort of this almost vertically integrated monopoly is a lot of what they sort of found in structured ways that works well, and it is what it is. But essentially they realized that was the opportunity, that if they were going to be able to disrupt that industry, they were going to need to sort of come at it entirely differently and approach the industry very differently. They knew they had a big opportunity because there was a lot of kind of margin baked into the eyeglasses industry, and that's where the industry came from, is they sort of went after it and figured out who had relationships with whom, who was sort of structured with whom, and sort of said, all right, how do we kind of play outside of those existing players to sort of build a vertically integrated concept that's outside of that one? And today, Warby Parker is one of the fastest growing kind of emerging opportunities. And I think it's always funny. One of the professors who's sort of written a number of books, named Adam Grant, always talks about the fact that these MBA students came to him and said, hey, we've got this idea, would you like to invest? And he famously passed on it, saying, I don't understand this whole startup thing right there. And it turned out they were onto something, and I think that was where Warby Parker has come from. And there's a whole lot of other decisions that happened, but it really did come from understanding the ins and outs of the industry, and it was sort of the MBAs unpacking what was going on, why are prices structured the way that they are, to see who's related to whom, who has contracts with whom, and how this whole industry works. So when you walk into many of the retail distributors you find for eyeglasses, you'll see that the names, if you dig into them, are actually sort of all connected up and down the stack right there. So the people who are sort of the retail distributors are also connected to the manufacturers, are also connected to the wholesalers, and so it is one of those stacks that just does require someone outside of it. So that's an example of finding this as a tool right there. The other example that I think is pretty good to talk about is SpaceX. And if you've read Elon Musk's the book that was written about him was really, really fascinating. And it talks about after he had sort of helped sell PayPal to eBay, he was sort of looking for his next adventure. And some of his friends sort of thought he was a little bit crazy because he was fascinated by space and wanting to go into the space industry. And so he, was ready to go try and buy a rocket from Russian officials to send a rocket into space. And he went over there ready to go do this and, sort of looked at the price and was going to spend some of his payout from the sale of PayPal. And, he sort of like was trying to negotiate the price for this rocket down. It was costing something like $8 million and he was ready to do it. And he sort of said, no, I'm not going to do this one, backed away and sort of, was frustrated by the whole transaction, all these sorts of things. And basically said, I can't understand why this industry works this way. And so we sort of broke down with some industry insiders how the rocket industry worked. How did the rocket pricing work? Why are they so expensive? And as he started to look at it, he realized sort of the biggest cost, that was one of the things that he thought he could solve, was actually sort of the rocket boosters. As they would go up, they would sort of fall back into the ocean, and all the electronics and all the pieces of that sort of booster would be lost. And so that cost right there was a gigantic portion of the actual cost of the rocket itself. And so he started asking questions about, well, what if we could effectively land that portion of the rocket on a launch pad? Could we do that? What would the cost look like? And to this day, now that's sort of what SpaceX strategy has been. And if you're like me and you watch their launches and their landings in the way that you do, you can see that there is something super cool about being able to take that part that was sort of disposable and make it reusable, right? That right there has contributed to a major cost. And it really only happened because Elon sort of dug into something that he calls the first principles theory. And sort of what he talks about is, let's break this down into the very, very core things, the very first principles. Ask the questions that are at the base level of something. And so in this case, he said, well, why is the rocket cost of this portion of it so high? Why can't we fix this? Why can't we renovate this? Why can't we rebuild this piece right there? And they said, well, the salt water, doesn't work with the electronics and these sorts of things. And he asked the questions, could we land it? And I think most people thought he was crazy at the start, and turns out now that's been sort of the secret sauce behind SpaceX. And if you're looking for a good kind of show to watch, you're interested in rockets, you can tell I'm sort of into this stuff. The National Geographic and Ron Howard have produced a really interesting mini-series on Mars, going to Mars. And they talk a lot about this decision to sort of create this reusable landing rocket has been a really, really important thing for our future colonization of Mars. If we want to do that, would be to have a rocket that you could land and then take back off right there. And so some of the technology is interesting, not only getting rockets into space right now for satellites, but for future exploration, it's going to be really important. And if you think a friend of mine, Steve Davis, works at SpaceX, and he famously wears a shirt that says "Occupy Mars," and that's sort of the SpaceX mantra. And part of it is because they realized that in order to do sort of interplanetary travel, we needed to figure out this type of solution. So anyway, long story for you, but that's an example of kind of first principles, this follow the money, divide the pie sort of thing, understanding really to break down the overall cost of an $8 million rocket, what actually makes it up, and what are the things that you can affect and change. And that's a really key way of innovation right there. So when you think about this approach, divide the pie, follow the money, whatever you want to call it right there, it really does use the same concept of first principles, breaking something down into pieces, understanding the parts, the money, the cost, the time, whatever it is right there, to sort of understand where the opportunity may lie. And so it does start with some research, right? You really do need to understand it. And in kind of the SpaceX case or the Warby Parker case, you heard they spent a lot of time researching and understanding the numbers aspects of it. And that's important to understand that oftentimes you may be looking for opportunities where there's baked in margins, there's additional costs, there's time that's spent. Those are the things you're looking for. So the key thing to start with is understanding that industry, that problem, that specific thing you want to dig into. And first, get as deep as you can to the core level. So in the case of the rocket, you want to understand the core components, you want to understand the core components of the core components, and you want to understand the raw materials that make up into it. That's what's sort of important right there, to know what happens. And I think even if you think about another example of Elon Musk's sort of empire, you think about the importance of batteries in cars. And one of the crazy things that people have said about Elon is that effectively he's building a way to battery power a lot of the country and the world, right? Essentially, they have cars that require batteries. They're now building sort of their interior battery that can store solar power, kind of their power wall is what it's called. And to do that, in order to build this, you need lithium to create the lithium batteries. And so, experts have said that one of the reasons that SpaceX, Tesla, and SolarCity are all interrelated right there is batteries tied together, and even more particular, it's lithium. And so Elon knows that lithium may be the key thing that ties this all together. And so SpaceX is not only about colonizing Mars, but ultimately about finding an asteroid that is rich in lithium and mining it so that you can wind up having lithium to build all these sort of future inventions around battery power and things like that. So sort of crazy. I know it's sort of crazy to think about, but you can see when you start to actually take these things down to the fundamental levels, the first principles, you can see how there might be big innovations hidden inside these things. And so why SpaceX and Tesla and SolarCity, why do they relate? Could be something as crazy as mining asteroids for lithium right there. Now again, the key thing to understand about this one when you divide the pie is you sort of have to break things down into core components. So let's take an example here that I think people can sort of get their head around a little bit is, let's just say you're interested in restaurants and you say, hey, I want to sort of build a concept that is about restaurants, and I'm fascinated by the industry, I've worked in it, I want to know how to make it more efficient right there. So the first thing you would do is go out and find the data sources. So the National Restaurant Association, the NRA, the other NRA, actually every year publishes sort of a state of the industry. And so you'd go out and find out, what do the average restaurant have for revenue, for cost, for time, for people, all those sorts of things right there, and then break it down into pieces. How much is being spent on marketing right here? How much is being spent on labor? How much is spent on food costs? What types of food costs? Continue to break that down until you get to the point where you may know the first principles. So maybe you understand that there's some interesting things going on, there's some margin, break it down into its core right there. So an example here with restaurants, let's just use this. This is based on some NRA data, the National Restaurant Association. And let's say you're thinking of this as a way to find an idea. Well, you look at the graph right here and you can see that this is the sort of costs that make up the restaurant. And you can see the profit slice, pretty small, about 1.8% profit on a restaurant. So not a lot of profit that's baked into a restaurant concept right there. So you're looking for other opportunities to add efficiency. You can see the big buckets right there, salary and wages and their cost of sales. So let's just say you're thinking about, I want to go out and I want to figure out a way to make marketing more effective. Well, if you look at this one, sort of the spend right there, if you assume that there's almost sort of a $1 trillion sort of in the restaurant industry right here. Let's just use that as the number right here. You can look and see or it's a little less than that, probably like 800 million, but whatever it is, you can see that like the spend on advertising is only about $17 billion as an industry volume in total. But cost of sales is about $252 billion. So I told you that one of my last businesses was called Vendor IQ, and we were sort of helping small businesses identify ways to work with vendors that would help them keep their costs low and be high rated. And so we looked at the chart just like this and said, there's a lot of innovation going on in helping restaurants market themselves right there, but it's actually sort of a small part of their spend. It's not going to help them be more efficient potentially. Now it'll help with revenue and these other things, but boy, look at how big that cost of sales is. The food cost itself it's massive. Same thing, look at the cost of salary. And so as we went out there, we looked and said, all right, maybe those are areas where there's more money, more places to play. Now it's complicated, it's challenging, but it sort of led us to say, well, let's look where the money is and sort of divide the pie that way. So that's, I think, the way you think about this one. Again, you can approach it a little bit like this first principles. You can see how you deconstruct an industry where something seems off or unusual. In the case of Warby Parker, in the case of SpaceX, they said something seems odd here. We got to figure out it and sort of break this down into assumptions that are sort of baked in. Why are glasses the way they are? Well, it turns out there's some industry structural things that require it. So if you're gonna beat them, you got to figure out a way to beat around it right there. And that's, I think, the important thing. So as you think about this one again, particularly from a numbers standpoint, this is an important way to approach it. And I will tell you that as someone thinking about innovation, at some point, this information is going to be critical to you anyways, right? If you want to drive a new innovation, you're going to need to know these things. So it's not wasted time if you sort of say, well, I got to understand the restaurant industry, because others are going to want to know what you know about this space whenever you're building innovation in it. So it's early stage research can help you in these things, and ultimately you may find an interesting insight there that may lead you to a Warby Parker or a SpaceX or something else altogether. So that is follow the money, divide the pie, first principles, all those sorts of things wrapped into one. And again, get your spreadsheet out and see what you can discover.